October on the Canadian River breaks smells like nothing. No dust, no cut grass, no river mud, just cold moving fast across open ground, pulling the scent out of everything it touches. The sky sits low and tin-colored, and the wind has the patience of something that knows it has all winter to work. A man stands in the doorway of a cabin that is already twisting on its sills. His hands are split at the knuckles. Behind him, a boy coughs into a blanket. Against the south wall leans one cord of green cottonwood, the kind that burns fast and gives almost nothing back. On the door frame, scratched with a nail, 6 tally marks, then a question mark. Rowan Acker was 37 years old and had never built anything meant to last through a plains winter. He had cut foundation stone in western Pennsylvania for 11 years, clean blocks, squared edges, mortar joints tight enough to hold back a river. He knew stone the way a butcher knows bone, but cutting stone for other men's buildings and surviving a Texas panhandle winter in a cabin he did not own were two different kinds of knowledge, and the gap between them was about to kill him. He had come west following railroad work after the quarry closed. Pick and hammer men were cheap along the grade lines, and Rowan was strong enough to swing 12 hours and steady enough to keep the wall plumb when the man beside him could not. He saved $71 over 2 seasons. That money was supposed to buy time, time to file on land, time to prove he could work a claim, time to build something that belonged to him instead of a company or a foreman. Then his sister died. Clara Acker Poole had followed her husband to Dodge City, where he sold harness leather and drank what he earned. When he disappeared south toward Indian Territory, owing money to men who did not forget debts, Clara was already sick. The fever took her in 9 days. Rowan arrived on the 6th. He sat with her while she burned, and on the 7th day she asked him to take the boy. Milo was 12, thin-wristed, quiet, with a cough that flared when dust blew or the air turned cold. He had his mother's narrow face and his father's habit of watching doorways as though expecting someone to walk through them who never would. Rowan had no wife, no house, and no plan for a child. He said yes because Clara was his sister, and because Milo had no one else, and because saying no was not something Rowan Acker knew how to do when someone he loved was dying. They left Dodge City in September of 1885 with a mule named Saint, a cracked box stove strapped to a borrowed wagon, 2 sacks of cornmeal, 1 side of bacon, 4 blankets, and $26 in coin. Rowan had purchased, or believed he had purchased, a lease on a half-finished claim cabin near the Canadian River Breaks in Hemphill County. The seller was a land speculator named Pardee who operated out of a hotel in Mobeetie. Writing leases on parcels he described with the confidence of a man who had walked every foot of them and the penmanship of a man who had not. The cabin sat on a low bench above a dry wash, 3 miles from the river and 12 miles by wagon track from the nearest supply counter. It was 14 feet by 18 feet, built of cottonwood logs that had been cut green and had already begun to twist as they dried. The roof was cedar poles covered with sod that sagged in the middle. The chinking between the logs was a mix of mud and grass that had cracked and fallen out in patches, leaving gaps wide enough to push a finger through. The door was a plank frame covered in rawhide that had stiffened and warped. There was no floor. There was no window glass. There was a stove pipe hole in the roof that did not quite match the pipe from the cracked box stove. Rowan stood in the doorway on the 3rd day of October and looked at what $71 and a dead sister's last wish had bought him. Milo sat on the wagon seat behind him, wrapped in a blanket, coughing. 1 cord of split cottonwood leaned against the south wall. Cottonwood burns fast and cool, a poor fuel even when cured, and this had been cut green. Rowan did not need to count the days to know the math. Winter on the Panhandle could start in November and last through March. A cabin this size, with walls this loose, would eat fuel the way a sick animal eats, constantly, without gaining strength. 6 cords of good wood was the minimum an experienced plainsman would stockpile. Rowan had 1 cord of bad wood, 4 weeks of reasonable weather, and a mule that was already thin from the road. He had $26. Nails cost money, glass cost money. A second blanket for the boy cost money. Cornmeal at the supply counter ran 60 cents a sack when the freight wagons came through, and $1.20 when they did not. The numbers did not work. Rowan knew numbers. He had calculated stone loads and mortar volumes for years, and the arithmetic of survival on this bench above the dry wash was as clear as a bid sheet. He did not have enough wood. He did not have enough money. He did not have enough time, and he had a boy who coughed. On the 9th day, the arithmetic got worse. Rowan heard the horses before he saw them. 2 riders came up the wagon track from the south, moving at the unhurried pace of men who were not visiting. The first was a lean man in a canvas coat with a deputy's badge pinned through the lapel. The second was heavier, sitting his horse like a man who owned the ground beneath it. The deputy was Tom Bivens. The heavier man was Jory Kells, foreman for the Bar Crescent cattle outfit, which ran stock across 40,000 acres of leased range north of the Canadian. Kells did not dismount. He sat his horse and looked at the cabin the way a man looks at a dog that has gotten into the wrong yard. Bivens dismounted. He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat and held it out to Rowan. The paper was soft with moisture from the deputy's sweat, and the ink had begun to bleed at the creases. Pardee never held clear title to this section, Bivens said. His voice carried the flat tone of a man delivering news he had delivered before. The Bar Crescent lease covers this quarter. Kells here has the registered paper. Rowan took the document. He read it slowly. The legal language was thick, but the meaning was thin. The cabin he had paid for sat on land that belonged to someone else's lease, and the man who had sold him the right to be here had sold him nothing. Kells spoke from his horse. I could have you removed today. The deputy would do it clean, but I'm not unreasonable. He shifted in the saddle. You have a mule. That mule is worth about what you owe in trespass. Sign the animal over, and I will let you stay through the end of November. After that, you walk. Milo stood behind Rowan in the doorway. The boy said nothing. His hand rested on the door frame, and his knuckles were white. Rowan looked at the paper. He looked at Kells. He looked at Saint, who stood at the picket line with her ears forward, watching the strange horses. The mule stays, Rowan said. Kells smiled the way a man smiles when he has expected an answer and received it. Then you have no agreement with me. The deputy will note your refusal. When I come back, it will not be to negotiate. They rode south without looking back. The paper stayed in Rowan's hand, growing softer in the wind. Milo asked, What does it mean? Rowan folded the paper and put it in his coat. It means we have less time than I thought. Ephraim Bell arrived 3 days later, not because he had been sent, but because word traveled the breaks the way water traveled the draws, downhill, and without asking permission. Bell was 64. He had hunted buffalo on the staked plains when the herd still darkened the grass, and he had watched the bones bleach and the cattle replace them. He had survived 4 panhandle winters in structures that ranged from a dugout to a sod house to the plank and adobe building he now occupied 8 miles east. He was not a cruel man. He was a precise one. He had learned that the plains punished imprecision the way a forge punishes wet metal, violently and without warning. He walked the cabin. He pressed his thumb into the chinking gaps. He kicked the base log on the north wall and watched dust fall from the joint above. He counted the wood pile by eye, moving his lips as he calculated. "You have half a frame," Bell said. "Logs are green and already twisting. Chinking will not hold through the first hard wind because the gaps will widen as the wood dries. Your roof sag will collect snow until the weight brings it down, or the melt rots the poles." He turned to the woodpile. "That is maybe 1 cord. Maybe 1 1/4 if you stack it tight. A cabin this loose needs 6 cords minimum for a mild winter, 8 for a bad one. Cottonwood burns 1/3 faster than oak, and yours is green, so call it 1/4 the heat value of what you actually need." Rowan listened. He did not argue. Bell was not saying anything Rowan had not already calculated, but hearing it spoken aloud by a man who had survived what Rowan was about to face made the numbers heavier. Bell looked at Milo, who sat on the wagon tongue whittling a stick with a dull knife. The boy needs a roof that does not leak, walls that hold heat, and food that is not just corn. You cannot give him any of those things with what you have here. Bell's voice was not unkind, but it carried the weight of a man who had seen settlers die. "I have watched men better set than you freeze out before Christmas. You have no cured wood, no tight walls, no help, and 1 lame mule." "Saint is not lame," Rowan said. "She will be. The ground here turns to iron when it freezes, and mule hooves split on iron." Bell pulled his hat lower against the wind. "Listen, Kells is not a generous man, but he is a practical one. If you leave clean, he may let you work the Bar Crescent line camp through winter. It is honest shelter. The boy would be warm." "Working for the man who stole my claim." "Working for a man who holds the paper. There is a difference, and the difference is whether your nephew sleeps under a roof or under a wagon." Rowan said nothing for a long moment. The wind picked up from the north, and a strand of loose chinking lifted from the wall and dropped into the dirt like a dead snake. "Stone is for graves and chimneys," Bell said. "It will not warm a man. I know you cut stone, Acker. But this is not Pennsylvania. The wind here does not go around things, it goes through them." Bell mounted his horse. "You have until the first hard norther. After that, the land decides." He rode east, and the dust from his horse's hooves blew north before it could settle. Rowan tried the conventional path first because he was stubborn, not stupid. He spent 4 days re-chinking the cabin walls. He mixed red clay from the washbank with dry grass and strips of flour sack, pressed it into every gap, smoothed it with his palm, and let it set. The work was slow, and the material was poor. The clay cracked as it dried. The grass shifted. The cloth strips pulled free when the wind caught their edges. On the 5th night, he lit the stove and fed it until the iron glowed red along the belly. The cabin warmed. Milo pulled his blanket down from his chin and slept with his mouth open for the first time in a week. Rowan sat by the door and watched. At midnight, the wind shifted north. Not a norther, just the ordinary night wind of the open plains, steady and cold and patient. Within an hour, the temperature inside the cabin dropped enough that Milo's tin cup, half full of water and sitting on the floor near the north wall, developed a skin of ice. Rowan held his hand near the north wall. The chinking was intact. The clay had not cracked. The gaps were filled. But the wall itself, the cottonwood logs, breathed cold. The wind did not need to come through the gaps. It pushed against the logs, and the logs conducted the cold inward, and the stove on the opposite wall could not replace what the north wall stole. He fed the stove again. 2 armloads of green cottonwood. The fire crackled and spit and threw sparks against the stove lid. The iron belly glowed, and still the cup by the north wall held its ice. Rowan sat on the dirt floor and did the math again. If 2 armloads bought him 4 hours of marginal warmth on an ordinary November night, a true norther, the kind Bell described, the kind that drove cattle south until they piled against drift fences and froze standing up, would eat his entire woodpile in a week. Less if the temperature dropped below zero. Less still if the wind found the gaps that would open when the green logs twisted further. He was not failing because he lacked fuel. He was failing because the cabin gave the heat back. The fire was not the problem. The walls were the problem. The wind was the problem. And on the open panhandle, the wind was the one thing no man could outwork. Milo coughed in his sleep. The sound was dry and tight, the cough of a boy whose lungs did not like cold air. Rowan pulled the blanket higher over the boy's shoulders and sat back against the south wall, where the stove heat still reached. He watched the ash in the stove grate. A fine gray powder, light enough to stir when the draft pulled. He noticed it then, not for the first time, but for the first time with attention. When the wind gusted outside, the ash inside the stove moved. Not up the pipe, sideways, toward the north wall, where the gaps between logs acted like tiny bellows, sucking air through the cabin with every gust. The cabin was not just cold, it was ventilated. The wind did not need to break in. The cabin invited it. The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived the way most useful things arrive, in pieces across days, assembled from accidents. On the 11th day, Rowan carried the stovepipe outside to clear a creosote plug. He set the pipe against the cabin wall and stacked loose river stones around its base to keep it upright while he worked. The stones were round and rough, pulled from the washbank where the Canadians' floods had tumbled them smooth on some faces and left others jagged. A gust hit while he was scraping the pipe interior. The wind was sharp, enough to flap his coat collar and sting his eyes. But the flame he had left burning inside the stove, visible through the open pipe hole, did not roar or flatten. It steadied. Rowan stopped scraping. He looked at the stones around the pipe base. They were piled loosely, gaps between everyone, nothing mortared, nothing fitted. A crude ring of rock no higher than his knee, and the flame behind them had steadied instead of surging. He crouched and held his hand behind the stones. The wind was there, but changed. It came through the gaps between the rocks, broken and slow, not in a single driving force, but in small, confused currents that pushed against each other and lost momentum. The wind that had slapped his face at full force arrived behind the stones as a murmur. That night, lying on the dirt floor while Milo slept, Rowan remembered his mother, not the dying. Clara's death had temporarily buried all earlier deaths beneath its weight, but a specific afternoon in the stone spring house behind their Pennsylvania farmstead. Rowan was 9. His mother held a lantern in the narrow space between the spring house's outer stone wall and the inner wooden door. The air smelled of damp lime and cold water. She tapped the stone. "Feel this," she said. He pressed his palm flat. The stone was cold, deep cold, the kind of cold that lived in rock the way warmth lived in bread, baked in, patient, slow to leave. "Now feel the door." He touched the inner wooden door. It was cool, but not cold, not the bone-deep cold of the stone. "Stone holds cold unless you keep the wind off what matters," his mother said. She held his hand in the air gap between the stone wall and the wooden door. The air in the gap was still. Not warm, but still. No draft, no movement. Just a pocket of trapped air that served as a barrier between the stone's cold and the door's fragile warmth. "The stone takes the weather," she said. "The air holds the line. The wood keeps the living." Rowan had filed this away the way a child files most of what adults say, without understanding, without urgency, as background knowledge that might never surface. 28 years later, lying in a leaking cabin on the Texas Panhandle with a sick boy and a cracked stove and less than one cord of green cottonwood, the memory surfaced like a stone rolling up from a riverbed. He sat up in the dark. The stove had burned low. The ash drifted sideways. Stone alone was wrong. Bell was right about that. A solid stone house would conduct cold inward like a pipe conducts water. But stone was not what he needed. What he needed was the space between stone and wood, the dead air, the gap where wind could not reach. If he could break the wind before it hit the cabin walls, the cabin would not need to be perfect. The chinking could crack. The logs could twist. The gaps could widen. None of it would matter if the wind arrived at those gaps already broken, already slow, already robbed of the force that turned every seam into a bellows. He did not need to fix the cabin. He needed to build a wall around the wind. Rowan spent 2 days testing before he committed. He stacked loose river stones along a 4-foot section of the north wall, leaving the stones 2 feet from the logs. He did not mortar them. He did not fit them. He piled them rough, the way he had piled them around the stovepipe, fist ahead sized, round and broken and jagged, with gaps between everyone. The wall was 3 feet high and 18 inches thick at the base. That night, he taped 3 strips of flour sack inside the cabin at chest height, one on the north wall behind the test stones, one on the east wall where no stone stood, one on the south wall by the door. The wind came from the northwest after midnight, steady and cold. Rowan checked the strips at dawn. The north strip hung still. The east strip pulled sideways, steady as a flag. The south strip trembled. He took the test further. He lit a candle and carried it along the inside of each wall. At the north, behind the stones, the candle flame leaned but held. At the east, the flame bent flat and nearly died. At the south, it danced with every gust. The difference was not subtle. It was obvious. 4 feet of loose river stone, unmortared, 2 feet from the cabin wall, had turned a driving northwest wind into something the cabin could resist. But 4 feet was not a wall, and north was not every side. Rowan sat on the wagon tongue and drew in the dirt with a stick. The cabin was 14 by 18 feet. If he built a stone ring around it, freestanding, not touching the logs, 2 feet of gap on every side, the outer dimensions would be roughly 18 by 22 feet, plus the wall thickness itself. Call it 22 by 26 feet at the outer face, with the wall running 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top. He calculated the volume, a wall 2 feet thick, 6 feet high, running the full perimeter. Roughly 35 to 40 cubic yards of stone. At 100 pounds per cubic foot for loose river rock, that was 60 to 70 tons. 70 tons. He looked at Saint, who stood at the picket line chewing the brown grass with the slow patience of a mule who does not know she is the only engine a desperate man owns. At half a ton per wagon load, the most the borrowed wagon could hold without breaking an axle, he needed over 120 trips to the river wash and back. The wash was 1.5 miles by the easiest track, 3 miles round trip. At the mule's pace, with loading and unloading, each trip would take most of a morning or an afternoon, 2 trips a day on good days, 1 on bad days. None on days when rain turned the track to grease, or Milo's cough kept Rowan inside. He had perhaps 30 working days before winter shut the operation down. The numbers were impossible. Again. Della Russ came to see the test wall on the 14th day, not out of friendship, but out of the specific curiosity of a woman who had survived 2 winters alone and did not trust any man's method until she had seen it with her own hands. Della was 32. Her husband had died of a snake bite the previous spring, Not the dramatic kind where the man falls and never rises, but the slow kind where the wound turns black and the fever takes 2 weeks and the wife watches it happen without a doctor within 50 miles. She had 2 milk cows, a sod house that did not leak, a Winchester rifle she could shoot better than most men on the breaks, and a sharp understanding of labor that came from doing everything herself since April. She stood at the test section and looked at the stones. She looked at the gap. She pressed her hand against the cabin logs behind the stones the way Rowan's mother had pressed his hand against the spring house door. "It is quieter," she said. Not a compliment, an observation. "The wind breaks on the stone," Rowan said. "The gaps between the rocks scatter it. What comes through has lost its force. The air in the gap does not move enough to push through the log seams." Della looked at the east wall, where no stones stood. She pressed her hand there. She did not need Rowan to tell her the difference. "You will spend winter hauling cold rock around a house that already leaks," she said. "Every hour you spend dragging stone is an hour not spent cutting fuel. If you are wrong, you will freeze behind a very decorative wall." "I know." "If the wall collapses inward, it crushes the cabin. If snow fills the gap, the dead air becomes a cold sink. If cattle push through a loose section, drafts return, and you have lost the time you spent building." "I know that, too." Della looked at him with the expression of a woman who had cataloged every way a plan could fail because she had watched her husband fail at smaller plans than this. Rowan picked up a flat stone from the test pile and a slat board from the wood pile. He held the board upright and blew hard through a gap at its base. The candle behind it bent flat. Then he laid loose pebbles in a shallow wooden tray and set the tray between himself and the board. He blew again, same force, same angle. The candle flame leaned but held. "The stone does not stop the wind," Rowan said. "It disorganizes it. A solid wall would create pressure on one side and suction on the other. The wind would curl over and hit the cabin from above. Loose stone breaks the gust into pieces that fight each other. By the time the air reaches the log wall, it has lost most of its push." Della watched the candle. She did not endorse him. She did not laugh. She picked up one of the pebbles, turned it in her fingers, and set it back down. "You had better be right," she said, "because the boy cannot afford for you to be wrong." She left without saying goodbye. Rowan watched her ride east, her back straight in the saddle, her rifle in its scabbard. She had not mocked him. She had done something harder. She had taken him seriously enough to list every way he could fail. The store was a dugout cut into a rise along the Tascosa Road, roofed with cedar poles and sod, and operated by a man named Pruitt who sold flour, coffee, tobacco, nails, and gossip in roughly equal measure. By the third week of October, the gossip had a new subject. Cal Voss heard it first because Cal Voss heard everything that might turn a profit or eliminate a competitor. Voss was 41, a freight middleman, an informal lender who operated from a plank warehouse near the Tascosa crossing. He bought goods in bulk from Dodge City supply trains and resold them to settlers at prices that reflected not the cost of the goods, but the cost of the settlers' desperation. He held debts from 3 families on the breaks and benefited directly when desperate men sold tools cheap before abandoning their claims. Voss wanted Rowan's cabin site, not the cabin, the site. The bench above the dry wash had reliable water access and sat at a natural crossing point where Bar Crescent cattle moved to winter grass. Kells had offered Voss first purchase on the quarter section if Rowan abandoned it. Voss had already calculated the resale value. A man building a rock wall around a log cabin was not, to Voss, a curiosity. It was an obstacle. If Rowan succeeded in surviving the winter, his claim would strengthen. If he failed and left, Voss could buy the site for back debt prices. Every stone Rowan hauled was a stone in Voss's path. Voss arrived at the cabin on a cold Tuesday with a smile and an offer. $15 for the mule, he said, not dismounting. Fair price for an animal that will be worth nothing by January. Take the money, buy passage for you and the boy to Dodge City. Start somewhere that makes sense. Rowan was loading stones into the wagon. His hands were split along the knuckles, the skin cracked from cold water and rough rock. He did not stop loading. The mule is not for sale. Everything is for sale when the weather turns. I have watched it happen every year since I came here. A man arrives in September full of plans. By December, he is selling his tools. By February, he is walking east with nothing but the clothes and the lesson. Voss leaned forward in his saddle. You are building a rock fence around a cabin that does not belong to you, on land you do not lease, with a mule you cannot feed. That is not a plan. That is a fever. The wall is not a fence. The wall is evidence that you have lost your mind, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. Pruitt says the men at the counter are calling it Acker's rock cage. You know what a rock cage is. It is what you build around a grave so coyotes do not dig. Rowan set a stone in the wagon bed. It weighed 40 pounds, and he placed it with the care of a man who cannot afford to break a board. Bell says the boy should be with sensible people, Voss continued. I do not disagree. A child with a cough in a cabin with holes, tended by a man who hauls rocks instead of wood, that is not care. That is endangerment. Rowan stopped. He turned and looked at Voss directly for the first time. You come here again talking about my nephew, and I will not sell you the mule. I will use her to drag you back to your warehouse. Voss smiled. It was not the smile of a man who was afraid. It was the smile of a man who had found the lever he was looking for. Think about it, Voss said. The offer stands until the first snow. He rode north, and Rowan stood in the wagon bed with cracked hands and a stone at his feet, and the knowledge that the fight had just changed from weather to something sharper. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Rowan marked the wall line on a Thursday morning with cotton cord and cedar stakes. 2 feet from each cabin wall on all 4 sides, then 2 feet of stone thickness beyond the gap. He walked the perimeter with the cord, measuring by boot length where his measuring tape fell short, and drove stakes at every corner and every 8 feet along the run. The outer footprint measured roughly 22 feet by 26 feet. He dug a shallow rubble trench around the entire line, 6 inches deep, to keep the base course from skating outward when the ground froze. The digging was slow. The topsoil was thin and rocky, and beneath it the clay was dense enough to ring when the shovel hit. Milo kept tally marks on a cedar plank leaned against the cabin wall. Each mark was 1 wagon load. On the first day of real hauling, Rowan made 2 trips to the wash and back. Each load was roughly half a ton, as much as Saint could pull without straining on the uphill grade from the riverbed. He unloaded by hand, stone by stone, sorting as he went. Flat faces to one pile, round to another, long, narrow stones to a third. His hands split further. The river stones were cold and wet, and the rough faces ground against his palms until the skin opened along the lines where calluses had softened during the weeks without quarry work. He wrapped his hands in strips of flour sack and kept hauling. The wraps turned brown with blood and gray with stone dust by midday. By the end of the first week, Milo's tally showed 12 marks, 12 half-ton loads, 6 tons. Rowan needed 60 to 70. At this pace, with weather and rest days, he would finish sometime in January. Winter would not wait until January. The ground began to freeze at night. The wagon track to the wash grew ruts that hardened into ridges, and the ridges broke the wagon's rhythm until each trip was a series of jolts that loosened the load and shortened the mule's patience. Saint planted her feet once on the third morning and would not move until Rowan unloaded 4 stones and lightened the pull. Rowan adjusted. He started loading smaller stones, faster to gather, easier on the mule, but more trips required. The math shifted but did not improve. 16 loads by the end of the second week, 20 by the 19th day. Milo's tally marks marched across the cedar plank like fence posts on a line that had no end in sight. The first course of the wall rose on the west side, the windward face, the side that mattered most. Rowan laid the heaviest stones at the base, flat sides down, leaning each one slightly inward, the way a bricklayer leans a wall to resist outward pressure. He had no mortar. He had no cement. He had gravity and friction and the habit of fitting stone that his hands remembered even when his body wanted to stop. The base was 2 feet thick. He nested the stones the way a stonemason nests rubble fill, large faces out, smaller pieces packed into the voids between them, nothing smooth, nothing fitted to a seam. The wall would not be pretty. It was not supposed to be pretty. It was supposed to break wind, and wind does not care about aesthetics. By the 20th day, the west wall stood 3 feet high along a 12-foot section. Rowan pressed his hand against the cabin logs behind it and felt the difference. The logs were cold, but the draft that had pulled ash sideways through the stove was gone from this section. The flour sack strip on the north wall still pulled. The strip on the west wall hung quiet. 3 feet high, 12 feet long, one face of a wall that needed to be 6 feet high, 2 feet thick, and 100 feet around. November arrived with a sky the color of old tin and a wind that smelled like nothing, no dust, no grass, no river, just cold, moving fast with the patience of something that knows it has all winter to work. Milo's tally showed 31 marks. The west wall was nearly waist high. The north wall had barely begun. The east and south walls were lines of cord and stakes in frozen dirt. And somewhere on the open plains to the north, the first real norther was gathering itself. Rowan fed the stove. He watched the ash. On the west side, where the stones had risen, the ash sat still. On the north, where the wall had not yet reached, the ash drifted sideways in the draft, moving toward the gaps in the logs, pulled by wind that did not know it was supposed to be stopped. He closed the stove door. He looked at Milo, asleep under 3 blankets, breathing in the slow rhythm of a boy who trusted that the man in the room would keep him warm. Rowan pulled on his gloves. The splits in his knuckles had dried into dark lines that cracked again every morning when he made a fist. He stepped outside into the wind and walked to the wagon. There was stone to haul. And the wall was not finished. The man at the river did not introduce himself. He stood on the far bank of the wash where the stones were thickest, watching Rowan load the wagon with the patient attention of someone who had nothing better to do and no intention of helping. Rowan had been loading for 20 minutes. His system was crude. Wade into the shallow water where the best stones collected, pry them loose, carry them to the bank, roll them into the wagon bed. The stones were slick with river clay, and every third or fourth one slipped from his grip and landed on his boot or his shin. His shins were bruised purple from ankle to knee. The man watched him drop a flat stone the size of a saddle skirt. It hit the wagon edge, split along a hidden seam, and fell in 2 pieces into the mud. "You have worked rock," the man said. His voice was accented, something northern, something that shaped vowels differently than Texas did. "But you have not worked loose rock." Rowan looked up. The man was 58 or 60, built like a post, not tall, but square, with hands that were wider than they should have been, and shoulders that sat forward as though permanently braced against something heavy. His beard was gray and trimmed close, and he wore a wool coat that had been patched so many times the original fabric was a guess. I have worked cut stone, Rowan said, quarry block, foundation courses. Cut stone behaves. You tell it where to sit, and it sits. Loose stone has opinions. The man walked along the bank, looking at the stones Rowan had already loaded. He reached into the wagon bed and turned a round stone so that its flattest face pointed down. You are loading for weight. You should load for nest. Every stone needs two neighbors underneath it, or it rolls when the wagon hits a rut and you lose a quarter of your load on the track. Rowan looked at the wagon bed. 3 stones had already shifted during the last trip, and one had fallen off entirely. He had blamed the ruts. Who are you? Rowan asked. Niels Vangen. I built bridge cribs for the railroad, timber frames filled with stone to hold trestle footings against floodwater. Before that, I cut grade in Colorado. Before that, I was Norwegian. He said it the way a man says something he has said many times, without emphasis, as a fact that needed no decoration. You live on the breaks? I live where I stop. Right now I have a camp 2 miles south near the old Comanchero crossing. I came for water and found a man fighting stones that are smarter than he is. Rowan almost smiled. He had not almost smiled in weeks. Niels did not offer to help. He sat on the bank and watched Rowan load the rest of the wagon, correcting twice more. Once when Rowan stacked 2 round stones on top of each other without a flat base between them. And once when Rowan placed a long, narrow stone lengthwise instead of crosswise, where it would have acted as a lever and pried its neighbors loose on the first bump. When the wagon was full, Rowan climbed onto the seat and picked up the reins. Saint leaned into the harness. The wagon moved uphill without the grinding lurch that had been shaking stones loose for the past week. Niels was already walking south when Rowan turned to say something. The man did not look back. Niels came to the cabin site 3 days later without being asked. He stood at the west wall, now 4 feet high along its full run, and looked at it the way Bell had looked at the cabin itself, with the measuring attention of someone who understood what he was seeing. He pressed his palm against the stone face. He walked the length. He crouched at the base and sighted along the bottom course. Then he pushed against the wall at chest height with both hands. The wall did not move, but a stone at the top wobbled. Your batter is wrong, he said. Rowan stood behind him with a stone in each hand, waiting. Batter? The lean. A dry wall wants to lean inward, 5 degrees, maybe 7. Weight fights the bulge. You have built this section plumb, like a foundation course. Plumb is for mortar. Dry stone needs gravity pulling inward, or the first freeze-thaw cycle will push the outer face out and the whole run peels like bark. Niels took the wobbling stone from the top course, turned it, and set it back with its center of weight shifted toward the cabin side. The stone settled and stopped moving. You have done this, Rowan said. Not a question. I have done this at the bottom of rivers. Stone in a bridge crib works the same. No mortar, no time, only weight and interlock. If the crib leans in, the river pushes against it and the weight holds. If the crib stands plumb, the river finds the weakness and the whole thing opens like a hand. He walked to the north side, where Rowan had laid the first base course that morning. He knelt and pulled 3 stones from the second row. Harting, he said. He picked up smaller stones from the reject pile, pieces Rowan had set aside as too small to be useful, and packed them into the voids between the larger base stones. He pressed each one firm with his thumb until the gap was filled. The small stones do the real work. They keep the big stones from rocking. A wall without hearting is a stack. A wall with hearting is a structure. Rowan crouched beside him and watched. The packing was precise, not random, but considered. Each small stone was placed so that it wedged against two larger faces, creating a lock that friction alone would hold. The wall also needs to drain, Niels said. Your bottom course is tight. That is wrong. When snow melts or rain runs, the water needs a path out, or it freezes inside the wall and the ice jacks the stones apart. Leave the base course open, finger-width gaps at ground level. The wall breathes and lives. Rowan looked at the tight base course he had spent 2 days laying on the west side. It would need to be partially relaid. 2 days of work, adjusted. One more thing. Niels picked up a long, flat stone, roughly 3 feet from end to end, and laid it crosswise in the wall so that its ends projected from both the inner and outer faces. Tie stones. Every 4 or 5 feet of run, lay a stone that reaches through the full wall thickness, like a finger gripping both sides. The faces of the wall push out. The tie stones hold them together. Without tie stones, you have 2 skins with nothing between them, and the first hard push separates them. Rowan counted the tie stones in his west wall. There were none. He had built 2 feet of wall thickness, with no connection between the inner and outer faces. I built bridge cribs for 3 years, Niels said. I watched floodwater peel apart a crib that weighed more than this cabin because the men trusted weight without interlock. Weight resists. Interlock survives. He stood, his knees cracked, and he steadied himself against the wall with one hand. You are not building a house, he said. I can see that. You are building a break. The principle is sound. But the execution will kill you if the wall falls inward during a gale. A 2-foot wall at 6 feet high is heavy enough to crush a roof. Build it right, or do not build it. He looked at Milo, who had been sitting on the wagon tongue watching with the silent attention of a child who understands that adults are deciding something important. The boy keeps count? Niels asked, nodding at the tally plank. 38 loads so far, Milo said. It was the most he had said to a stranger in weeks. Niels looked at the wall, at the sky, at the calendar in his head. You need 120. You have 30 days. I know, Rowan said. Then stop building wrong and start building once. Niels came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and every morning for the next 11 days. He did not move into the cabin. He did not announce himself as a partner. He simply arrived at dawn, worked until his back stiffened in the early afternoon, and walked south to his camp before dark. He taught through doing. Rowan learned batter by watching Niels reject a stone, rotate it 5 degrees, and set it so that its weight bore inward. He learned harding by watching Niels fill a void with 3 small stones pressed so tight that pulling one required a tool. He learned tie stone placement by watching Niels lay a long flat stone across the full width of the wall and then test it by standing on it. If the stone rocked, it came out. If it sat firm, Niels nodded once and moved on. They did not talk much. Niels was not a man who taught with words when his hands could do the work instead. But when he did speak, the sentences had the compressed weight of things learned by consequence. Do not make the outer face smooth, Niels said on the 4th day, while Rowan turned a stone to present its flattest surface outward. You're not building a courthouse. A jagged face breaks a gust better than a flat one. Flat surfaces deflect wind up and over, it curls back down and hits the cabin roof. Rough surfaces chew the wind into pieces. Let the wall be ugly. Rowan turned the stone back so that its broken, angular face pointed out. The wall looked worse. It would work better. Wind slots, Niels said on the 7th day, pointing to a section where Rowan had packed the stones too tightly. You're sealing the wall. Do not seal it. Leave irregular gaps, not large enough for a fist, but large enough for air to slow as it passes through. A solid wall creates a pressure dam. The wind hits, piles up, and either goes over or finds the one weak spot and punches through. A porous wall bleeds the pressure gradually. The wind loses energy across the whole face instead of concentrating it at one point. This was the lesson that changed Rowan's understanding. He had been thinking of the stone wall as a barrier, stop the wind, block the cold. Niels was telling him it was a filter. The wind was not meant to be stopped. It was meant to be ruined, broken into harmless pieces that arrived at the cabin wall with so little force they could not push through the gaps in the logs. It was the difference between a dam and a sieve, and the sieve was stronger because it could not be overwhelmed. On November the 8th, Saint went lame. The mule had been favoring her left front for 2 days, a subtle shortening of stride that Rowan noticed only because he walked beside her for every trip and had learned her rhythm the way a man learns his own breathing. On the 8th, she planted the hoof on a frozen rut and flinched. Rowan knelt and lifted the hoof. The wall of the hoof had cracked along the quarter, a vertical split that would widen with every step on hard ground. Bell had predicted this. "Mule hooves split on iron," he had said, and the ground was iron now, frozen 2 inches deep every night, thawing only in the midday hours when the sun hit directly. 2 days without hauling. Rowan wrapped the hoof in burlap and tallow and kept Saint in the lee of the rising wall, where the wind could not reach her. Milo fed her cornmeal from his own ration, a handful at a time, and pressed his face against her neck while she ate. 2 days lost. Milo's tally stood at 51. The wall needed 120 loads minimum. The math was not improving. On November the 10th, rain turned the wagon track to grease. Rowan tried 1 load and lost half of it when the wagon slid sideways on the grade and tilted. He spent the afternoon retrieving stones from the mud and resorting them on the bank. Another day gone. On November the 14th, Milo's cough deepened. The boy's forehead was warm to the touch, not dangerously hot, but warm enough that Rowan kept him inside with the stove fed high and the blankets pulled close. Milo protested. He wanted to keep his tally, and Rowan set the cedar plank inside the door where the boy could mark it without leaving the blankets. Rowan hauled alone. Without Milo to guide Saint on the track while Rowan loaded, each trip took longer. The loads were smaller because Rowan could not roll the heaviest stones into the wagon bed without a second pair of hands to brace the wagon tongue. 56 loads, 59, 63. The wall rose, west side complete to 6 feet, north side to 4 feet, east side to 3 feet, south side, where the door was, barely started, just the base course and the beginning of what would become the dogleg entry. Niels worked on the east wall while Rowan focused on the north. They did not discuss the division. Niels simply walked to the east side one morning and began laying stone as though he had always been assigned there. His work was faster than Rowan's, not because he was stronger, but because he wasted no motion. Every stone he picked up went into the wall. Rowan still picked up 3 stones for every 2 he placed, rejecting and resorting. Niels chose once and was right. Cal Voss returned on November the 18th. This time he did not come to the cabin. He went to the supply counter at Pruitt's dugout store and bought every coil of cheap wire Pruitt had in stock, 8 coils of twisted fence wire, the kind settlers used for everything from fixing wagon rails to binding rafters. He paid cash. Then he sent word through Pruitt that the wire was available to Rowan at 3 times the purchase price. Rowan needed wire. Not much. Occasional ties where the wall wanted to bulge outward at the corners, and bindings for the cedar stake braces that held the upper courses while the weight settled. Without wire, he would need to cut and notch wooden pegs, which took time he did not have. The message was clear. Voss was not trying to sell wire. He was trying to make the wall fail by removing a small but necessary material. It was the strategy of a man who understood that desperation lived in the details. Della Rusk arrived at the cabin on November the 20th with 2 coils of old fence wire in her saddlebag. The wire was rusted and stiff, salvaged from her dead husband's tool shed. She set the coils on the wagon tongue without ceremony. "This is a loan," she said, "against you being right." She looked at the wall. It had changed since her last visit. The west and north sides were complete, or nearly so, rough, ugly, leaning inward, with jagged faces and irregular gaps between the stones. It looked like the ruin of something ancient, not the construction of something new. "It does not look like anything I have seen," she said. "It is not supposed to look like anything," Rowan said. "It is supposed to break wind." Della ran her hand along the outer face of the north wall. Her fingers found a tie stone, one of the long, flat stones that Niels had taught Rowan to lay crosswise, and she tapped it. "Who taught you this?" she asked. "A Norwegian who builds bridge cribs." "Is he sane?" "Saner than me." Della left the wire and rode east. She did not say good luck. She did not say she believed. She brought wire, and that was harder than either. Ephraim Bell returned on November the 22nd, riding the same horse, wearing the same expression of precise skepticism that he had worn on his first visit. The wall had changed the cabin's silhouette. From a distance, the structure no longer looked like a log cabin on a bench. It looked like a log cabin trapped inside a rough stone corral, which was exactly what the men at Pruitt's counter had been saying. Acker's rock cage. Bell walked the perimeter. He touched the stone. He leaned against the west wall and felt it hold his weight without shifting. He looked at the batter, the hearting, the tie stones. He looked at the gaps between the stones and put his hand behind the wall to feel the air in the 2-foot space. "It is quieter in the gap than I expected," he said. "The wind breaks on the outer face," Rowan said. "What comes through the gaps has lost direction. The air in the gap barely moves." Bell walked to the east side where the wall stood only shoulder high. He pushed against the top course. A stone wobbled. "This section is not finished." "I know. I need another 10 days for the east and south." Bell looked at the sky. The clouds were high and thin, moving fast from the northwest. "You may not have 10 days. The animals are restless. My old mare stood at the fence this morning, facing south, and she does not do that unless something is building." He turned to Rowan. "I will say this. The west wall is better built than I expected. The work is sound, but a wall is not a test. A norther is a test, and a norther does not knock on a wall and ask for permission. It leans on a house until the house tells the truth about itself." He mounted. "Finish the entry. If you build a straight opening in the south wall, the wind will funnel through it like water through a flume and undo everything the other 3 sides accomplish. Make it crooked." It was the first practical advice Bell had given. Rowan took it. By December the 10th, the wall was complete on the west and north, 6 feet high, 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top, leaning inward at 5 to 7 degrees. The east wall stood 5.5 feet, nearly done. The south wall was the weakest, 4 feet high, with the dogleg entry still unfinished. Rowan had built the entry the way Bell suggested, not a straight gap in the stone ring, but a narrow passage that turned twice before reaching the cabin door. A man walking in would enter from the southeast, turn left, walk 4 feet, turn right, and face the door. Wind following the same path would have to make 2 sharp turns, losing force at each one. The passage was 3 feet wide, enough for a person carrying a load, tight enough to choke a gust. Niels inspected the entry and approved. "The top course must not be proud," he said. running his hand along the capstones. If wind catches a loose stone at the top, it becomes a weapon. Lay the capstones flat and heavy, and set them slightly below the wall line so there is no edge to catch. They spent a day resetting capstones. Niels showed Rowan how to choose flat-bottomed stones for the top course and how to tap them with a hand maul, not to shape them, but to test whether they rang true or contained hidden fracture lines. A stone that thudded was solid. A stone that rang had a crack inside and would split in the cold. Rowan hung 3 new flour sack strips inside the cabin, one on each wall, waist-high, where drafts had once pulled the strongest. On a windy evening, the north and west strips hung still. The east strip stirred slightly. The south strip, near the unfinished entry, still pulled with each gust. Milo said the house sounded different. "It sounds farther away from outside," he said, and Rowan understood exactly what he meant. The roar of the wind, the constant wearing pressure of air moving across open plains and hitting everything in its path, had become muffled on the protected sides. The cabin was not warmer, but it was quieter, and quieter meant the wind was losing its fight with the walls. Rowan counted the woodpile, 3 cords, barely half of what Bell had prescribed as the minimum, but the stove was burning 1 armload less overnight than it had before the wall rose. If the pattern held, if the wall continued to reduce the cabin's heat loss the way the test section had, 3 cords might stretch where 6 would have been consumed. Might. The word carried the weight of everything Rowan did not know about what was coming. Niels told Rowan to leave a shovel inside the cabin, not in the gap. "Snow will seal the outer passage first," he said. "If you need to clear the entry, you need the tool where you can reach it, not where the snow has already buried it." Rowan put the shovel beside the door. He put the hand maul beside it. He stacked the remaining firewood against the inside of the south wall, where it would stay driest. He filled the water bucket and set it on the stove shelf where it would not freeze. He checked the stove pipe for creosote and scraped it clean. Then he waited. The weather signs came in the order that old plainsmen had cataloged for years. A warm afternoon that felt wrong, too warm for December, with a softness in the air that made the skin prickle. Cattle moving south in loose groups, unhurried but determined, following an instinct that preceded weather by hours. Clouds building from the north, not the high thin streamers of ordinary cold fronts, but low, dense formations with a blue-black belly that swallowed the horizon line. Bell rode to Rowan's cabin on December the 28th and stood in the gap between the rock wall and the logs. He looked north. "That is a bad one," he said. "The color is wrong. Blue-black like that means the cold is stacked high, not a surface wind, but a column of Arctic air falling south. When it hits, it will not taper. It will arrive at full force." Rowan looked at the south wall, 4 feet high. The entry was finished, the dogleg turned twice, the capstones were set, but the south face itself was the lowest and weakest section of the ring. "Will 4 feet hold on the south side?" Bell shook his head slowly. "It may not matter. A norther comes from the north. Your strong walls face the right direction, but when the wind wraps around a structure, it creates suction on the leeward side. The south wall does not need to stop the wind. It needs to prevent the wind from pulling air out of the gap through the back." Rowan had not considered this. He looked at Niels, who had arrived an hour earlier and was studying the south face with the same concern. "He is right," Niels said. "The gap is a channel. If the north wind pushes air in and the south wall is too low to contain it, the air accelerates through the gap like water through a narrowing creek. You lose the stillness." They had 1 day, maybe less. Rowan, Niels, and Milo hauled stone from the nearest supply, the reject pile, and the loose stones scattered along the washbank within walking distance. No wagon trips. Hand carried stone by stone across 200 yards of frozen ground. Rowan carried stones that weighed 50 and 60 pounds. Niels carried what his back allowed, 30, sometimes 40. Milo carried stones the size of bread loaves, 2 at a time, walking with the focused determination of a boy who understood that the wall was the only thing between him and the kind of cold that kills. By nightfall, the south wall had gained another 18 inches. Not 6 feet, not 5. 4.5 feet with the capstone set loose and heavy. It was the weakest section of the ring, and they all knew it. Niels stood in the gap and listened. The wind had not yet shifted, but the air had changed, a pressure drop that made ears feel thick and made the mule stand with her head low and her tail clamped. "It will come tonight," Niels said, "or tomorrow morning at the latest." Della Rusk rode in at dusk. Her face was tight with the expression of a woman making calculations that did not add up. Her youngest, Amos, had croup, the barking cough that closed a child's throat and turned breathing into labor. She needed to reach Bell's place, 8 miles east, where Bell's wife had camphor and experience with sick children. "If the wind turns tonight, I cannot make 8 miles with the boy on a horse," Della said. "Not in the dark. Not in a norther." Rowan looked at Della. He looked at the wall. He looked at the cabin, 14 by 18 feet, with a cracked box stove and 3 cords of green cottonwood. "If you cannot make Bell's, come here," he said. Della looked at the wall, the rough, ugly, leaning ring of riverstone that half the settlement called a rock cage and the other half called proof of madness. "The wall will hold?" she asked. Rowan did not answer immediately. He had never tested the wall against what was coming. He had tested it against ordinary wind, against November gusts, against the steady cold of early December nights. He had not tested it against the kind of norther that killed cattle standing up and buried men within sight of shelter. "The wall will break the wind," he said. "That is all I have ever asked it to do." Della rode east toward Bell's. The sky behind her had turned the color of iron. The norther arrived on December the 29th, 1885, and it arrived the way Bell had described, not as a gradual change, but as a wall of air that crossed the open prairie with the weight and speed of something physical. The morning began warm. Strangely, wrongly warm. Rowan stepped outside at dawn and felt sweat prick his neck under his collar. The air was thick and still. Saint stood at the picket line with her ears flat, refusing to eat. Milo sat inside the cabin with his hands wrapped around a warm tin cup, watching the doorway. By noon, dust lifted from the south. Not storm dust, lifting dust, the kind that rises when air pressure changes faster than the ground can hold its surface. Cottonwood leaves along the wash showed their pale undersides, curling in a wind that had not yet arrived but was pulling the air ahead of it like a rope. At 2 o'clock, the sky to the north went black, not dark, black, a line of cloud so dense and low that it erased the horizon and turned the afternoon into a false twilight. The temperature had been in the 50s. Within 30 minutes, it was in the 20s and falling. The wind hit at 2:30. It came from the north-northwest, and it did not build gradually. It arrived at full force, a sustained gale that flattened the dry grass, drove sleet horizontal, and hit the north face of the stone wall with a sound like a freight wagon dropping its load. Rowan was inside the cabin. He heard the wind hit the stone, and then he heard what happened after. The roar broke. The sustained, coherent force of the gale fragmented against the rough, jagged, unmortared face of the rock wall and became 1,000 smaller sounds. Whistles through gaps, murmurs in the 2-foot space, the soft confusion of wind that had lost its direction. The cabin wall creaked. The logs shifted in their joints the way they always did when the wind pushed. But the push was different, weaker, scattered. The flour sack strips on the north wall hung still. The strip on the west wall trembled once and settled. The strip on the south wall, near the weakest section of the ring, pulled sideways, then eased. Inside, the stove burned steady. The draft through the pipe ran clean and straight, not surging and flattening with every gust the way it had in November. Milo sat on his blankets and watched the stovepipe as though it were telling him something. "It is working," Milo said. Rowan pressed his palm against the north wall. The logs were cold, but they were not breathing. The air inside the cabin was still. Not warm, the cracked box stove could only do so much, but still, and stillness was the difference between a cabin that held heat and a cabin that bled it into the night. Della arrived at 4 o'clock with Amos in her arms. She had turned back 3 miles from Bell's place when the norther hit and the road disappeared behind a wall of ground-blown snow. The boy was wrapped in 2 blankets and a buffalo robe, and his breathing was the sound of a saw cutting wet wood, harsh, ragged, labored. Rowan opened the cabin door. Della stepped through the dogleg entry, turning twice, ducking under the low capstones, and entered the cabin. She stopped. "It is quiet," she said. The word came out as something closer to disbelief than observation. Outside, the stone wall howled. Inside, the loudest sound was the stove lid ticking as the iron expanded. Rowan took Amos and set him near the stove on a folded blanket. The boy was 3 years old, small for his age, with a face flushed red from cold and fever. His cough was the croup bark, deep, metallic, involuntary. Della knelt beside him and held a damp cloth near the stove to make steam. 4 people, 1 stove, 3 cords of green cottonwood, a stone wall between them and a norther that was still building. The first hour passed. The stone wall held. Rowan checked the gap through a crack in the south wall logs. The 2-foot space between stone and timber was cold but still. Snow had begun to pack against the outer face of the north wall, filling the lowest gaps between the stones. This was expected. Niels had warned that snow would seal the outer face, and Rowan had left the base course open for drainage. The snow packed the upper gaps and actually tightened the windbreak, reducing the air that passed through. The second hour. The wind strengthened. Snow drove horizontal across the open ground, and the visibility outside the wall dropped to nothing. Rowan could not see the wash, could not see the wagon track, could not see the sky. The world had become white noise and cold. Snow began to fill the dogleg entry. The outer turn packed first, blocking the passage with a drift that rose knee-high in 20 minutes. Rowan took the shovel, inside, where Niels had told him to keep it, and cleared the passage from the inside out. The snow was dry and light, easy to move, but it returned as fast as he cleared it. He settled for keeping the inner turn open and letting the outer turn pack, reasoning that a snow-plugged entry was better than a wind-funneled one. The third hour. A capstone shifted on the west wall. Rowan heard it, a grinding, scraping sound that cut through the muffled roar of the storm. He stepped into the gap through the south entry and looked up. A flat stone near the top of the west wall had caught a gust at the wrong angle and slid 6 inches sideways. If it fell outward, it was harmless. If it fell inward into the gap where Rowan stood, it would fall 6 feet onto frozen ground. If it fell onto the cabin roof, it would punch through the cedar poles and sod. Niels appeared in the entry behind him. The old Norwegian had come to check the wall before the worst of the storm, walking 2 miles through the beginning of the norther, because he had built this wall alongside Rowan and was not willing to let it fail while he sat in his camp and listened. There, Niels said, pointing at the shifted capstone. The wind is curling over the top and lifting it from behind. We need to brace it. They worked in the gap, the narrow, freezing 2-foot space between stone and timber that was protected from the full gale but not from the cold. Rowan held a cedar pole vertical, while Niels wedged it between the cabin roof beam and the underside of the shifted capstone. The pole caught, the stone settled, and Niels tied the base of the pole to a roof peg with a length of Della's borrowed wire. The top course will be the weak point in every storm, Niels said. His breath came in short clouds. After this, reset the capstones with more overlap. Every stone should rest on 2 stones beneath it, never one. They retreated inside. Niels's hands were blue-white at the fingertips, and Rowan made him hold them near the stove until the color returned. The 4th hour. The stovepipe began to backdraft. Smoke that should have risen through the pipe and exited above the roof started coming back down. The cabin filled with a thin haze that stung the eyes and made Amos's cough worse. Della held the boy close and covered his mouth with a damp cloth. Rowan understood the problem. The wind was curling over the cabin roof, even the diminished wind that passed through the rock wall and creating a downdraft at the pipe exit. The smoke had nowhere to go. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the wall has stopped the wind, but the fire itself is turning against them. Niels reached for a piece of scrap tin from the stove shelf, a flat square that Rowan had saved from a rusted bucket. "Baffle," he said. He bent the tin into a shallow curve and wired it to the top of the stovepipe inside the cabin, creating a partial shield that redirected the descending air current to one side, while leaving enough gap for smoke to rise on the other. The smoke thinned. Not eliminated, the cabin still held a haze that made breathing shallow, but the draw returned enough to keep the stove functional. Amos's cough eased from the sharp bark to a wet rattle, which Della said was better. Air moving through sick lungs, she said, not air trapped. Hours 5 through 8. The norther reached its full force. The sound was no longer wind, it was weight, a physical pressure against the north wall of the rock ring that Rowan could feel through the cabin floor, a vibration in the frozen ground transmitted from stone base through earth to log sill. The stone wall did not move, it did not shift. It absorbed the force the way a riverbank absorbs current, by being heavier than the thing pushing against it, and by being too rough to give the push a clean surface to exploit. Inside the cabin, the 4 of them sat in a circle around the stove. Niels told Milo about bridge cribs in Colorado, how the river tried to take them every spring, and how the stone held if the men had packed it right. Della fed Amos small sips of warm water from a tin cup. Rowan fed the stove 1 stick at a time, counting the remaining wood against the remaining hours of storm. At midnight, they heard cattle. The sound came from the northeast, bawling, panicked, the sound of animals that had been driven south by the wind until they hit the drift fences that ranchers had strung across the open range to control grazing. The cattle could not pass the fences. The wind would not let them turn. They stood against the wire and froze. The bawling lasted 20 minutes. Then it stopped. The silence after was worse than the sound. Rowan looked at the flour sack strips. North wall, still. West wall, still. East wall, a faint tremor, barely visible. South wall. The strip near the entry pulled gently with the rhythm of the gusts, but the door held, and the dogleg passage, now half-packed with snow, was acting as a secondary baffle. The stove consumed wood, 3 sticks per hour. Rowan counted the remaining pile. At 3 sticks per hour, he had enough for 36 hours of burning. The storm might last 12. It might last 24. If it lasted longer, they would run short, but they would run short burning a third less fuel than a cabin without the wall would consume. At 3 in the morning, Rowan pressed his palm against the north wall one more time. Cold, but dry. No frost on the inner surface. No ice crystals forming along the log joints. The dead air in the gap was doing what his mother had described in the Pennsylvania spring house, holding the line between the stone's cold and the wood's fragile warmth. Milo slept. Amos slept, his breathing rough but steady. Della sat with her back against the south wall, her eyes open, her hand resting on the rifle she had carried in, because a frontier woman did not enter a building without her weapon, storm or no storm. Niels sat by the stove. His cough, the deep winter cough that had started the previous week, rattled in his chest. He did not mention it. Outside, the stone wall screamed. Inside, the loudest sound was the stove lid ticking. Pardon. The norther blew for 19 hours. It began to ease at 9 in the morning on December the 30th, not with a sudden stop, but with a gradual reduction, gusts spacing out, the sustained pressure relenting, the snow shifting from horizontal to diagonal to falling. Rowan opened the dogleg entry with the shovel. The outer passage was packed solid with snow. He dug for 20 minutes before he broke through to outside air. When he stepped through the gap, the world was white and still and broken. Snow had drifted waist high against the outer face of the rock wall. The top of the wall was rimmed with ice where sleet had frozen to the capstones. But the walls stood. Every course, every section. The tie stones held. The battered faces leaned inward exactly as Niels had built them. The south wall, 4.5 feet, the weakest section, had caught a drift on its outer face that had actually added height, packing snow against the stone like natural reinforcement. The gap between the wall and the cabin was cold. Snow had sifted through the upper courses and dusted the ground in the gap with a thin white layer, but the air in the gap was still. Rowan held his hand in the space and felt nothing. No draft, no movement. Just cold, quiet air that had served as an invisible barrier between 70 tons of storm-battered stone and 12 twisted cottonwood logs. He looked at the cabin door. It opened freely. The rawhide had not frozen to the frame. The sill was dry. He looked at the woodpile inside. He had burned 9 armloads in 19 hours. On a night in November before the wall, the cabin had consumed 2 armloads in 4 hours, roughly 9.5 armloads in 19 hours. The wall had saved him half an armload in a norther. The number was small, but the principle was not. In ordinary wind, the steady, daily, wearing cold of a panhandle winter, the savings would compound. Over a season, 3 cords behind the wall might last as long as 5 cords without it. Rowan stood in the gap between his stone wall and his log cabin. The wind had stopped. The sky was clearing from the west, blue and hard and cold. His breath made clouds that hung in the still air of the gap and did not move. Milo appeared in the doorway. His face was thin and his cough was dry, but his eyes were steady. "Is it over?" the boy asked. Rowan looked at the wall. He looked at the sky. He looked at the plains stretching north to the Canadian river breaks, white and silent and littered with the shapes of things that had not survived the night. "This one is," he said. Bell arrived before noon on the 30th with frost in his beard and a look on his face that Rowan had not seen before. It was not shame exactly. It was the expression of a man who had spent 40 years learning how the plains killed people and had just watched someone survive by a method he had dismissed. He dismounted at the outer edge of the rock wall and walked the perimeter the way he had walked it twice before, touching the stone, pressing the joints, testing the capstones with his palm. But this time he was not checking for weakness. He was reading the storm's signature. The The snow packed against the north face. The ice rimed along the west capstones where sleet had driven horizontal. The clean, dry stone on the south leeward side where the wall had created a pocket of calm. He stepped into the gap through the dogleg entry and stood in the 2-foot space between stone and timber. He held his hand out, flat, and felt the air. "Still," he said. "It was still during the storm," Rowan said. "The wind broke on the outer face and arrived in the gap without enough force to push through the logs." Bell walked the full gap, running his hand along the cabin wall. He stopped at the north side where the heaviest winds had struck and pressed his thumb into a chinking gap. The clay was intact. The flour sack beneath it was dry. On a cabin without the wall, that gap would have been a bellows, sucking cold air in with every gust, bleeding heat faster than the stove could replace it. "How much wood did you burn?" Bell asked. 9 armloads in 19 hours. Bell was quiet. His own cabin, tight-chinked, well-built, conventional, had consumed nearly twice that. He had fed the stove through the night until the woodpile outside his door was cut in half, and still the north wall had lost its chinking in 3 places, letting drafts run through his house like water through a sieve. He stood in the gap for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Rowan recognized as the cost of a man changing his mind. "I told you stone was for graves and chimneys. I was wrong." Bell looked at the rough, ugly, leaning wall of un-mortared river rock. "You used it like timber uses bark. The tree does not survive because the bark is warm. It survives because the bark takes the weather, so the wood beneath does not have to." Rowan said nothing. The compliment did not need an answer. It needed to exist between them, and it did. Bell looked at the cabin, at Della and the children inside, at the stovepipe still trailing its thin stream of smoke into the clearing sky. "Della's boy?" he asked. "Breathing. The croup is easing. The steam from the stovecloth helped." Bell nodded. "My wife has camphor. I will bring it today." He mounted his horse and paused. "Acker, the men at the counter will want to know what you did. When they come, do not be proud. Be clear. A proud man makes enemies. A clear man makes students." He rode east. The snow was already melting where the sun hit, and the track showed dark against the white ground. They came in 1s and 2s over the following week, riding in from claims scattered across the breaks, men and women who had spent the norther huddled in conventional cabins, burning wood at panic rates, listening to their walls whistle and their chinking fail. The first was a man named Coy Dillard, 36, who ran a small horse operation 4 miles north. His cabin had lost its north wall chinking entirely during the storm. He had stuffed blankets into the gaps and burned through 2 cords of mesquite in 19 hours. His wife had not slept. His daughter had cried until her voice gave out. Dillard walked the wall without speaking. He stepped into the gap. He looked at the flour sack strips still hanging inside the cabin, north and west still motionless, even in the ordinary afternoon wind. "How do I build one?" he asked. Rowan drew the design in stove ash on a flat stone. Inner warm wall, 2-foot airspace, rough outer break, crooked entry. He used a stick to show the cross-section. Cabin logs on the inside, gap, then the stone wall with its inward lean, its rough outer face, its tie stones running crosswise. "Do not let the rock touch the logs," he said. "If stone touches wood, cold conducts straight through. The airspace is the whole point. 2 feet minimum. Do not make the outer face smooth," he said. "Rough stone breaks the wind into pieces. Smooth stone deflects it over the top, and it comes down on your roof. Do not forget drainage. Open base course. If water pools inside the wall and freezes, the ice expansion tears the stones apart. Do not build the entry straight into the wind. Make it turn at least once. Twice is better. Dillard listened. He asked 3 questions: how high, how thick, how many loads, and left to start hauling. A woman named Lucy Strand came the next day. She lived alone on a half-section south of the wash and had nearly lost her milk cow when the north wall of her sod barn collapsed under snow weight. She did not want a full ring. She could not haul that much stone alone, but she wanted a north wall screen to protect the barn. Rowan walked her through the partial application. A north wall screen, 8 feet long and 6 feet high, set 2 feet from the barn wall. Less stone, less labor, but the same principle. Break the wind before it hits the structure. The screen will not protect the other sides, he said, but the north is where the northers hit. If you block that, the barn holds its heat on 3 sides and only loses on the one the wall protects. Lucy measured with her eye. She calculated loads. She left without thanking him because she was already planning. On the 4th day after the storm, 6 people came at once. They stood in the gap and touched the walls and asked questions that Rowan answered until his voice went hoarse. Niels stood beside him for 2 of these visits, correcting gently when Rowan described tie stone placement imprecisely or forgot to mention Harding. "You are telling them to lay big stones," Niels said after the group left. "You are not telling them to pack small stones between the big ones. Without Harding, the wall is a pile. With Harding, it is a structure. The difference is what happens when the wind pushes for 12 hours straight." Rowan adjusted his teaching. The next time someone asked, he started with Harding and built outward from there. The measurable results spread through the settlement the way warmth spreads through a well-packed wall, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. Bell kept records. It was his nature. He tracked his own fuel consumption against the weather and compared it to Rowan's reports from behind the rock ring. During the 2nd week of January, a sustained cold spell, not a norther, but 5 days of steady wind and temperatures near 0, gave him his comparison. Bell's cabin burned roughly 8 armloads per day to maintain survivable heat. Rowan's cabin, behind the rock wall, burned 5. The difference was not dramatic in any single day, but over 5 days Bell used 40 armloads to Rowan's 25. Projected across a winter, the wall saved a man nearly 2 full cords of wood. 2 cords was the difference between running short in March and having enough to last. 2 cords was the difference between a man spending February cutting emergency fuel in frozen river bottoms and a man spending February repairing his cabin and tending his stock. Bell told anyone who would listen. "The fire warms you," he said, repeating it until it became his phrase, his contribution to the method he had once dismissed. "The wall keeps the wind from stealing it." Della's cabin was the second test. Rowan and Niels built a temporary north side stone screen, not a full ring, just a 6-foot-high wall running the length of her sod house's north face, set 2 feet from the wall. The work took 3 days with 3 people hauling. Della rejected more stones than Rowan did, picking each one up, turning it, checking its face and balance before approving it for the wall or tossing it back on the reject pile. "You are pickier than Niels," Rowan said. "Niels builds for rivers. I build for my children." The screen worked. Della reported that her cabin's north wall stopped sweating frost on the inside surface during cold nights. The chinking held. The stove consumed less fuel. She did not say Rowan was right. She said the physics were right, which was a different kind of compliment and a more useful one. The innovation spread first as partial wind walls, north side screens for the most exposed cabins, and then as settlers gained confidence in stone as full or 3/4 rings for the newest and worst built structures. Not every cabin needed a full ring. Cabins with natural wind protection, set into hillsides, sheltered by cottonwood stands, positioned in draws, needed less. Cabins on open benches, exposed to the full sweep of the plains wind, needed the most. Rowan did not charge. He drew diagrams. He answered questions. He walked sites with settlers and helped them mark their wall lines and calculate stone loads. When someone built badly, too smooth, too tight, no harding, no drainage, he came back and showed them where the wall would fail before it did. He was not generous by nature. He was precise by nature, and precision demanded that the walls be built correctly or not built at all. A badly built wall was worse than no wall, because it gave false confidence and then collapsed when the wind proved it hollow. Cal Voss watched the spreading method with the focused attention of a man watching his livelihood erode. Voss's business model depended on desperation. When settlers ran low on fuel, they bought emergency wood from Voss at winter prices, 3 times the fall rate. When their cabins failed and they decided to leave, they sold tools and stock to Voss at abandonment prices, 1/4 of the value. When they needed wire, nails, glass, or flour between freight shipments, Voss was the only source, and his prices reflected his monopoly. A settlement that could protect its cabins with river stone, and labor was a settlement that needed fewer emergency supplies. A family that burned 5 armloads a day instead of 8 was a family that did not run out of wood in February and come begging to Voss's warehouse with their last dollars. Every stone Rowan stacked was money out of Voss's pocket, and Voss was not a man who watched money leave without trying to redirect it. He started with legal pressure. He told Pruitt to spread word that Rowan's cabin sat on Bar Crescent lease land, which was true, and that anyone who built rock walls on leased land was building improvements that would revert to the leaseholder when the settlers were eventually pushed off. The argument was designed to make settlers hesitate. Why build something permanent if the ranchers will take it? Rowan answered with a fact that Voss had not anticipated. The rock walls were freestanding. They were not attached to the cabins. They were not improvements to the land in any legal sense. They were piles of loose stone that could be disassembled and moved. A man who was pushed off his claim could leave his wall behind and build a new one on the next claim from local stone. The labor was portable, even if the stones were not. Voss shifted tactics. He claimed Rowan had stolen wire, the 2 coils Della had loaned him, and demanded payment or return. Della produced her dead husband's inventory ledger, written in his own hand, listing the wire as property of the Rusk household. Voss backed down, but the accusation lingered as gossip. Then Voss found a sharper angle. He went to Bell. "The man is building stone walls around cabins on open range," Voss said. "What happens when a grass fire sweeps through? Stone does not burn, but stone traps heat. A fire that hits a rock wall will create an oven. Anyone inside will bake." Bell considered this. It was not a foolish concern. Prairie fires were as real a threat as northers, and a stone enclosure could, in theory, trap radiant heat if burning grass accumulated against the outer face. Bell brought the question to Rowan. Rowan did not dismiss it. He walked to the gap and pointed at the base course, the open draining gaps at ground level that Niels had insisted upon. Fire needs fuel and air," Rowan said. "The gap between the wall and the cabin is bare ground, no grass, no fuel. A fire reaches the outer wall and has nothing to burn inside the ring. The heat radiates against the stone, and the stone absorbs it slowly. That is what stone does. The inner cabin wall, 2 feet away, receives radiant heat through still air, which is a poor conductor. The cabin does not bake. It warms." He paused. But Voss is not entirely wrong. If brush or tumbleweed collects in the gap, it becomes fuel. The gap must be kept clear. That is a maintenance rule, not a design flaw. Bell accepted this. Voss did not, but Voss's audience was shrinking. Niels Vangen did not talk about his cough. He coughed, and the coughing worsened, and he continued to work as though the sound coming from his chest was someone else's problem. Rowan noticed it first during the wall-building days before the Norther, a deep, wet rattle that surfaced when Niels bent to lift a heavy stone or climbed the short ladder to place capstones. Niels dismissed it with a wave of his hand, the way a man dismisses rain when he is already wet. After the Norther, the cough deepened. The cold had settled into Niels' lungs with the patience of something that intended to stay. He worked through January, helping Rowan teach settlers, helping Della build her north screen, helping Dillard lay his first base course. But each day started later and ended earlier, and the pauses between efforts grew longer. They built together in those weeks the way two men build who have different strengths and the same standard. Niels was the better stone reader. He could look at a face and know where it wanted to sit, which end was heavy, whether it would lock or roll. Rowan was the better laborer. He could haul more, lift more, work longer without his body failing. Together they could build a wall section in a day that would have taken Rowan 3 days alone. They talked during the work. Not much, and not about feelings. About stone. About bridges. About the physics of force and resistance that connected a railroad trestle in a Colorado river to a windbreak on the Texas Panhandle. Niels told Rowan about the bridge that failed. It was on a spur line near Pueblo, built in 1879. The cribs, timber frames filled with stone, had been packed by men who trusted weight to do the work. They filled the frames with the heaviest stones they could find and called it done. When the spring flood hit, the water found the voids between the stones. It entered through the upstream face, built pressure inside the crib, and blew the downstream face out like a cork from a bottle. The bridge dropped into the river and took a locomotive with it. 3 men died because the foreman did not believe in Harding, Niels said. He was sitting on a stone, resting between efforts, and his breath came in short, shallow pulls. He said the weight would hold. The weight held until the force found the empty spaces. Force always finds the empty spaces. Your job is to fill them first. Rowan carried this lesson the way he carried his mother's springhouse lesson, file deep, available when needed. In the second week of February, Niels and Rowan disagreed about method for the first time. The argument was about shared north walls. 2 neighboring cabins, Dillard's, and a newcomer named Gentry, sat 80 feet apart on the same bench, both exposed to the north wind. Rowan proposed building a single long stone screen that would protect both cabins, one wall, shared, running the combined length of both properties. Niels objected. A shared wall creates a shared dependency, he said. If one man neglects his section, the other man suffers. If Gentry leaves in the spring, Dillard inherits a wall he did not build and does not understand. Build them separate. Each man must know his own wall. Rowan argued that the shared wall saved stone and labor, 2 men hauling for one wall instead of 2. Efficiency is not the point, Niels said, and his voice had the edge of a man who had watched efficient shortcuts kill people. Independence is the point. A man who depends on his neighbor's wall is a man who dies when his neighbor moves. They built separate walls. Niels was right, and Rowan knew it before the second wall was finished. Gentry was careless. He laid stones without Harding, skipped tie stones, and built his base course tight against the ground, where frost would jack it apart by April. If that shoddy work had been connected to Dillard's sound wall, the failure would have propagated through the shared structure like a crack through ice. The disagreement taught Rowan something that would shape every wall he built afterward. The method was transferable, but the responsibility was not. Each person who built a rock windbreak had to understand it well enough to maintain it. A wall built by someone else and left to someone who did not understand it was a wall waiting to fail. Niels collapsed on February the 21st while helping Bell build an emergency windscreen on the east side of Bell's horse shed. The day was cold, but not extreme. A steady northwest wind, temperatures in the teens, the kind of winter day that the Panhandle produced dozens of in a season without anyone calling it a crisis. Niels had been lifting base course stones for an hour when his legs folded and he sat down hard on the frozen ground. He did not cry out. He sat with his hands on his knees and his head down, and the cough came in a long, tearing sequence that left blood on his lower lip. Rowan reached him first. He helped Niels to his feet, and the older man's weight against his arm was lighter than it should have been. Niels had been losing mass for weeks, the coat hiding what the body was surrendering, and the frame that had once been square and braced was now just thin. They brought him to Rowan's cabin inside the rock ring, where the stove kept the air warm and still. Della made broth from the last of a salt pork bone. Milo sat beside Niels's cot and read aloud from a seed catalog that was the only printed material in the cabin, reading the descriptions of corn varieties and melon types in a steady, careful voice, as though the words themselves could hold something together. Niels did not improve. The cough settled deeper. His breathing became the shallow, measured labor of a man whose lungs were filling with what they could not expel. Rowan sent Milo to Bell's place with a message, asking for Bell's wife and whatever medicine she had. The camphor arrived, and it eased the breathing, but it did not stop what was happening beneath it. On the third day, Niels asked Rowan to sit beside him. The cabin was quiet. Milo was outside feeding Saint. Della had gone home to tend her own children. "You will keep teaching," Niels said. It was not a question. "I will. Do not make them dependent on your hands." Niels's voice was thin but steady. "Make them trust their own. A man who needs you to build his wall is a man who loses it when you are gone. A man who builds his own wall carries it with him even if the stones stay behind." Rowan nodded. He did not trust his voice. "The boy listens," Niels said. "He hears what stone does. He hears the settling. Teach him to read a wall the way you read a quarry face, not with his eyes, but with his ears. Stone talks before it moves. The small clicks before a shift. The silence when a course is true. He can learn this if someone shows him it matters." Niels closed his eyes. His breathing slowed to the rhythm of a man who was no longer fighting what his body was doing. He died on the morning of February the 24th, 1886. Rowan was beside him. The stove was lit. The cabin was still. Outside, the wind pushed against the rock wall and arrived inside as silence. They buried Niels on the bench above the wash, where the ground was soft enough to dig. Rowan laid the grave with river stones, not a wall, but a cairn, the old way, rough and unmortared. Milo placed a flat stone at the head and scratched Niels's name into it with a nail. Rowan stood at the grave for a long time after the others left. The wind moved across the open ground and broke against the rock ring 20 feet away. The sound was the sound Niels had taught him to listen for, the murmur of force meeting resistance, scattered and diminished, arriving at the other side as something a man could survive. He found Niels's hand maul on the flat capstone where Niels had left it the day before he collapsed. The iron head was rimed with frost. The wooden handle was dark with years of grip oil and sweat. Rowan picked it up and set it inside the cabin, above the door, where it would stay. The fire came in March, on a day when the wind should not have been strong enough to matter. It started 4 miles southwest, in the dry grass along a draw that had not seen rain since January. The cause was likely a spark from a traveler's camp, a coal kicked loose, a gust at the wrong moment, tinder dry buffalo grass that needed no invitation to burn. By the time the smoke was visible from Rowan's bench, the fire was running northeast on a wind that had shifted from its usual north-northwest to a direction that no one on the breaks had planned for. Prairie fire on the Panhandle was not the slow, creeping burn of eastern woodlands. It was a running fire, flames 2 to 4 feet high in short grass, taller in the draws where dead brush had collected, moving as fast as a man could walk and faster than a man could run if the wind backed it. The sound preceded it, a low, continuous roar, like a distant river that was getting closer. Rowan smelled it before he saw it. The air changed, dry, sharp, with the acrid bite of burning grass and the sweeter, darker smell of mesquite brush catching. Milo came running from the wash where he had been gathering small stones for harding practice. "Smoke to the southwest," the boy said. His voice was steady. 3 months on the Panhandle had taught him to report danger without decorating it. Rowan climbed the rock wall on the west side, using the rough, jagged face as handholds, something the smooth wall he had originally built would not have allowed, and looked south. The fire line was visible, a ragged orange edge, maybe 3 miles out, moving toward them on the shifting wind. He climbed down and stood in the gap. The rock ring surrounded the cabin on all 4 sides. The ground inside the ring was bare, frozen dirt, scraped clean of grass and brush by 3 months of foot traffic, stone hauling, and deliberate clearing. The ground outside the ring was winter-dead grass, thin and dry, and perfectly suited to burn. The wall was not designed for fire. It was designed for wind, but the principles overlapped in ways Rowan was only now calculating. Fire needs 3 things: fuel, air, and heat. Inside the ring, there was no fuel. The 2-foot gap was bare ground. The cabin walls were cottonwood logs, flammable, but not exposed to direct flame if the fire had no fuel path across the gap. The ring itself was stone. Stone does not burn. The danger was radiant heat. If the fire reached the outer face of the wall and burned hot against the stone would absorb heat slowly. Stone's thermal mass was its strength in winter and its protection now. The heat would take time to conduct through 2 feet of rock. The air gap beyond the rock would further insulate the cabin. The cabin wall, 2 feet from the inner face of the stone, would receive radiant heat diminished by distance and diffused by still air. But the gap was not sealed. Wind could push embers through the gaps between the stones. Burning tumbleweed could roll into the dogleg entry. Sparks could land on the sod roof, which was dry enough to catch. Rowan had minutes, not hours. He sent Milo inside with the water bucket and a soaked blanket. "Wet the roof from inside if you see smoke above you. Do not come out." He ran to Della's place, 300 yards east. She was already outside, watching the smoke, her 2 children behind her and her rifle in her hand, because a rifle was what Della Rusk reached for when anything threatened, and sorting out whether it was useful came second. "The fire is coming from the southwest," Rowan said. "Your cow shed has no protection on the south side. Bring the children to my place. The ring will hold." "The cows," Della said. "I will come back for the cows. Bring the children first." Della did not argue. She gathered Amos and her older girl, Sarah, and rode for Rowan's cabin. Rowan turned back toward Della's cow shed, where 2 milk cows stood with their heads high and their nostrils wide, smelling what was coming. He untied them and drove them east, away from the fire line, toward Bell's place. They went reluctantly. Cows resist urgency with the passive stubbornness of animals that do not believe in haste, but they went. By the time Rowan returned to his cabin, the fire was close enough to hear. The low roar had become a crackling rush. and the smoke had thickened until the sun was a copper disk behind a gray veil. The fire hit the outer face of the rock wall at 3:30 in the afternoon. The grass along the west side caught first. Flames ran up to the base course and stopped, no fuel beyond the stone. Heat pressed against the rock face, and Rowan, standing inside the gap, felt the stone warm under his palm. Not hot, warm. The thermal mass of 60 tons of riverstone was absorbing the fire's heat, the way a river absorbs a thrown stone, slowly, massively, without hurry. Embers blew through the upper gaps, small, glowing fragments of grass and brush carried by the fire's own wind sailed through the spaces between capstones and landed in the gap. Rowan stamped them out. Each one was small, the size of a coin, barely glowing, but each one was a potential fire start if it landed on the cabin's dry sod roof or against the cottonwood logs. A burning tumbleweed rolled into the dogleg entry. It jammed in the first turn, exactly where the crooked passage was designed to stop wind, and burned itself out against the stone walls of the passage. Smoke poured through the entry, and Rowan wet a cloth and held it over his face. He worked the gap for 30 minutes, stamping embers, kicking burning debris away from the cabin walls, wetting the sod roof from below where he could reach it through gaps in the cedar poles. The work was hot and blind. Smoke filled the gap at times until he could not see the cabin wall 3 feet away, and the heat from the outer stone face built steadily, turning the gap from cold to warm to uncomfortably hot. But the cabin did not catch. The logs did not ignite. The sod roof smoldered at one corner where an ember had landed, and Milo poured water on it from inside before the smolder could spread. The stone wall took the fire the way it had taken the wind, absorbing, scattering, diminishing, refusing to pass the full force of the assault to the structure behind it. The fire passed. It moved northeast, burning itself out against the bare ground, along the wash where the river's flood path had scoured the grass away. The smoke thinned. The air smelled of charcoal and hot stone. Rowan leaned against the cabin wall, inside the gap. The stone beside him was warm, not hot enough to burn, but warm enough to feel through his coat. The thermal mass that had protected the cabin during the fire would now release its stored heat slowly over the coming hours, actually warming the gap and, through it, the cabin wall. The fire that had tried to kill them was going to heat their home for the night. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the weather turns. Della came out of the cabin carrying Amos on her hip. She looked at the scorched ground outside the wall, at the blackened grass stretching south and west, at the clear, bare dirt inside the ring. "The cows?" she asked. "Safe. I drove them toward Bell's." She looked at the wall. The outer face was streaked with soot and heat discoloration. The stone was intact. The wall had not shifted, not cracked, not failed. "Voss said the wall would bake us," she said. "Voss was wrong about the physics, but he was right that the gap needs to stay clear. If there had been brush or grass inside the ring, we would have burned." Della nodded. She set Amos down. The boy tottered toward Milo, who was standing in the doorway with the wet blanket still draped over his shoulders like a cape. "I want one," Della said. "A full ring, not a screen, a ring." It was the first time she had asked for anything from Rowan without calling it a loan. Voss did not come to see the fire damage. He heard about it from Pruitt, who heard about it from Dillard, who had watched the fire pass Rowan's cabin from a ridge a mile east and had seen the flames stop at the stone wall as though they had hit a river. The story that traveled was simple. The fire that burned 4 miles of grass and destroyed 2 brush shelters and killed 6 head of cattle had stopped at Acker's rock cage. The very thing the settlement had mocked was the thing that had held. Voss's fire objection, his best argument, his sharpest angle, had not merely failed. It had been answered by the event itself. The stone wall had done exactly what Voss predicted, in reverse. Instead of creating an oven, the wall had created a fire break. Instead of trapping heat, it had absorbed it. Instead of killing the people inside, it had given them the only safe ground within a mile. Voss retreated to his warehouse and said nothing for 2 weeks. The silence was worse than his arguments, because silence from Cal Voss meant he was calculating, and calculation from Voss meant someone was about to pay for something they did not owe. But Rowan did not have time to worry about Voss. He had walls to build, settlers to teach, and a method to spread before the next norther arrived. And the northers on the Texas Panhandle always arrived. Rowan changed the way he taught after the fire. Before, he had drawn diagrams and answered questions and walked sites and hoped that settlers would build correctly. After Niels's death in the fire, he understood what Niels had meant about independence. A settler who copied a diagram was building a wall. A settler who understood why the wall worked was building knowledge. He started requiring practice. Before he would help anyone mark a wall line on their property, they had to build a sample corner, 4 feet long, 3 feet high, 3 courses with hearting, 1 tie stone, proper batter. He watched them build it and corrected as they worked. If the corner stood when he pushed it, they could start their wall. If it wobbled, they tore it down and rebuilt until it held. Della became the best student. She was better than Rowan at spotting bad stones. Stones with hidden fracture lines. Stones with faces that looked flat but were not. Stones that would rock under weight instead of locking. She picked up each stone, turned it in her hands, pressed her thumb against the grain, and made a judgment that was right more often than Rowan's. "You have a feel for it," Rowan said, watching her reject a stone he had approved. "I have a feel for things that will fail," she said. "A woman alone learns to read weakness. In stone, in men, in weather." She did not smile when she said it. It was not a joke. It was the compressed philosophy of a person who had survived by judging correctly and who could not afford to judge wrong. Their partnership grew through work. Della brought milk for Milo. Rowan fixed the place where her sod roof met the wall cap, sealing a gap that had leaked during every rain since her husband died. She rejected his stones. He accepted her corrections. Neither of them said what the other could see, because saying it would have required stopping work, and neither of them was willing to stop. Milo watched them the way children watch adults who are becoming something new to each other, with quiet attention, and with the first cautious hope he had allowed himself since his mother died. Rowan developed the improvements through trial, not theory. Each problem the walls encountered became a lesson, and each lesson became a refinement that he passed to the next settler who asked. The first improvement came from dampness. In late February, the snow that had packed against the outer face of the north wall during the norther melted. The meltwater ran down the inner face of the stone, pooled at the base course, and seeped into the gap. The ground inside the gap stayed wet for 3 days, and the wet ground conducted cold upward into the airspace, reducing the insulating effect. The gap that had been still and dry during the norther became damp and chill during the thaw. Rowan solved it with drainage. He widened the base course gaps on the downhill side of the ring, creating channels where meltwater could escape outward instead of pooling inward. Then he laid a shallow gravel bed inside the gap. River pebbles, an inch deep, sloped away from the cabin wall, so that any water that entered the gap would drain to the outer edge and out through the base. The second improvement was seasonal. In spring, when the winds died and the temperatures rose, the rock wall trapped warm, stale air in the gap. The cabin grew muggy. Moisture from cooking and breathing collected on the inner stone face and bred mildew. A wall designed to keep wind out was now keeping air in. Rowan built half-height summer vents, removable stone gaps low on the leeward side of the ring. In spring and summer, he pulled 3 or 4 base course stones from the south wall, opening gaps that let slow air circulate through the gap without admitting direct wind. In autumn, before the first cold snap, he replaced the stones and packed them tight. The wall breathed in summer and sealed in winter. The third improvement came from Della. She noticed that the shutters she had mounted on her cabin windows were exposed to wind during storms, even behind the rock screen. The wind that passed through the stone gaps was diminished but not eliminated, and the diminished wind was enough to rattle loose shutters and push cold air through the window frames. "Put the shutters inside the gap," she said. "Mount them on the inner face of the stone wall, not on the cabin. The wind hits the stone, passes through broken, hits the shutter, and arrives at the window as nothing." Rowan tested it. The double barrier, stone, then shutter, then air gap, then cabin wall, reduced window drafts to nearly zero. It was a better solution than his, and he told her so. "It is the same principle you already built," Della said. "I just added a layer." The fourth improvement was communal. Dillard and a settler named Petrie had built their cabins 60 feet apart, both exposed to the north wind. Building separate walls, as Niels had insisted, protected each cabin independently. But the open ground between the cabins remained a wind channel that funneled gusts into the workyard, where both families stored tools, hung meat, and tended cook fires. Rowan proposed a shared north wall, not connecting the 2 cabin rings, but bridging the gap between them. A freestanding stone screen, 6 feet high and 60 feet long, set north of both properties. Behind the screen, the workyard became a sheltered commons where wind arrived broken and slow. This was the application Niels would have resisted. It created shared dependency, but Rowan built it differently than he would have before the disagreement. He built it in sections, 3 20-foot segments with narrow gaps between them, so that if one section failed or one family left, the remaining sections still functioned. Independence within cooperation. The lesson Niels had taught, adapted for a community that was no longer a collection of isolated cabins, but a settlement that shared wind and weather and, increasingly, walls. Teaching changed Rowan more than building had. Building was physical. It demanded his hands, his back, his endurance. It exhausted his body and satisfied his mind. Teaching demanded something different: patience, clarity, the ability to see his own method through the eyes of someone who did not yet understand it. He discovered that the hardest thing to teach was not technique. Technique could be demonstrated: batter, harding, tie stones, drainage. A settler could watch Rowan lay a course and replicate it within an hour. The hardest thing to teach was judgment, knowing which stone to pick up and which to leave behind. Niels had possessed this judgment naturally. He could glance at a stone and know its weight, its balance, its fracture tendency, and its best position in a wall. Rowan had learned it through repetition. Some settlers learned it quickly. Others never did. The ones who never learned were not stupid. They were impatient. They picked up the nearest stone instead of the right stone. They laid 3 courses in an hour, and were proud of the height without noticing that the wall was already leaning wrong. They skipped harding because the small stones seemed unimportant. They forgot tie stones because the wall looked solid without them. Rowan learned to spot the impatient builders early. He gave them the sample corner test twice. If they failed twice, if they could not build a 4-foot corner that held when pushed, he told them to hire help or wait until someone who understood the method could supervise. "I would rather you build no wall than a bad wall," he told a settler named Marsh, who had failed the corner test 3 times. A bad wall teaches you to trust something that will fail. When it falls during a norther, you will not have time to build a second one. Marsh was angry. He had hauled stone for a week and wanted to see a wall rise. Rowan understood the anger. He had felt it himself when Niels corrected his first base course. But Niels had been right then, and Rowan was right now, and being right mattered more than being liked. Della helped with the teaching. She took the women, not because the work was gendered, but because the women trusted her in ways they did not yet trust Rowan. A widow who had survived alone carried an authority that a man with a method could not match. When Della said the wall worked, the women believed it because Della would not waste her time on something that did not. She taught differently than Rowan. He taught by correction, watching the student build and stopping them when they went wrong. She taught by demonstration, building alongside the student, matching them stone for stone, letting them see the difference between her choices and theirs without telling them which was better. Her students learned faster because they learned through comparison instead of criticism. "You are a better teacher than I am," Rowan said one evening, watching Della walk Lucy Strand through a tie stone placement. "I am a better listener," Della said. "You hear what the stone says. I hear what the person says. The stone is easier." Calvos came back into the story the way weather comes back, not because it has been invited, but because it has nowhere else to go. Through March and into April, Voss watched his emergency supply business contract. Fewer settlers ran out of wood. Fewer came to his warehouse, desperate for wire or nails or flour at winter prices. The families who had built rock walls, even partial screens, had burned less fuel, kept their cabins tighter, and arrived at spring with reserves they had never carried before. Voss's debts still stood. 3 families owed him money from the previous autumn, and he collected with the meticulous patience of a man who understood that debt was the most reliable crop on the frontier. But new debt was not forming at the rate he needed. Settlers who could protect their cabins with riverstone and labor did not need Voss's credit to survive the winter. He tried one more angle. In April, when the settlement gathered at Pruitt's store for a supply train arrival, Voss stood on the porch and addressed the group. "Acker is turning this settlement into a colony of rock forts," Voss said. His voice was reasonable, the voice of a man expressing concern, not hostility. "Every family hauling stone is a family not plowing. Every man building a wall is a man not building a barn or a fence or a corral. The ground here is cattle ground. The money is in stock, not in rock. And the man encouraging you to pile riverstone around your cabins instead of building proper structures is a man who does not own his land, does not hold a clear lease, and is one visit from Jory Kells away from losing everything he has built." It was a good speech. It was factually accurate in every detail. Rowan did not own his land. The Bar Crescent lease still covered his quarter section. Kells had not returned, but the legal cloud remained. And Voss was right that the time spent hauling stone was time not spent on other work. Rowan was not at the store. Della was. She stood at the back of the group with Amos on her hip and Sarah holding her skirt. She waited until Voss finished, and then she spoke in the flat, carrying voice of a woman who had learned that volume was less persuasive than clarity. "My cabin lost its north wall chinking in the December norther," she said. "I burned all my fuel in one night and brought my sick child to Acker's rock house because it was the only shelter that held. The wall Acker built kept 4 people warm through a 19-hour storm on 3 cords of green cottonwood. My north screen built after the storm cut my fuel use by 1/3 through January and February. The fire in March reached my property and stopped at the stone. My cows survived because Acker drove them to safety while the wall held his cabin and my children." She shifted Amos on her hip. "Tigachi, Voss offered Acker $15 for his mule in October and told him the boy should be taken away. Now he is telling you that Acker's method is a waste of your time." She looked at Voss directly. A man who profits when settlers fail is not the man I trust to tell me what is good for settlers. The store was quiet. Voss met Della's eyes and held them for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then he picked up his hat from the porch railing and walked to his wagon. He did not speak publicly against the walls again. But the final reckoning came in May, and it came not from Della's words but from the wind, a late spring gale, unusual for May, driven by a storm system that dragged cold air down from the north 2 months after winter should have released its grip, hit the settlement on the 14th. It was not a norther. It was a sustained westerly 40 miles an hour with gusts higher, carrying dust and grit that scoured everything it touched. Voss's warehouse sat on the Tascosa Road with no wind protection. It was a plank building, well built by freight warehouse standards, but it was designed for storage, not for endurance. The west-facing wall caught the full force of the gale. The planks flexed. The nails holding the roof battens worked loose in the vibration. A section of tin roofing peeled back like the lid of a tin can, and the wind entered the warehouse through the gap with a howl that could be heard a quarter-mile away. Flour sacks split, loose goods scattered, a barrel of nails tipped and spilled across the floor. Voss stood in his warehouse and watched the wind destroy his inventory with the expression of a man who was learning something he had refused to learn from anyone else's experience. From his warehouse door, Voss could see Della's cabin 300 yards east. The rock screen, the full ring that Rowan had built after the fire, stood against the westerly gale, and behind it, Della's cabin sat quiet. Her chimney smoke rose in a thin straight line, bending only when it cleared the top of the wall. The wind that was tearing Voss's roof apart was arriving at Della's cabin as a murmur. Voss came to Rowan's cabin the next morning. He did not ride. He walked, which was unusual for a man who believed that walking when you owned a horse was a confession of reduced status. He stood at the edge of the rock ring and did not enter the gap. Rowan came out through the dogleg entry and stood opposite him. They had not spoken directly since October, when Voss had offered $15 for Saint and had suggested that Milo should be taken away. "What would it cost," Voss said, "to put one of these around my warehouse?" His voice was flat, not friendly, not hostile, the voice of a man making a transaction. Rowan looked at him. "The stone is free. The labor is yours. I will teach you the method the same way I teach everyone. But I have a condition." "Name it." "Your apology to the boy first." Voss's jaw tightened. The muscles along his cheek worked, and for a long moment the two men stood on opposite sides of a line that was not visible but was as real as the stone wall behind them. "The boy," Voss said. "Milo. You told this settlement that he should be taken from me. You said it to strangers. You said it where it would travel. He heard it from a child at Pruitt's store who heard it from her father who heard it from you." Voss was quiet for a long time. The wind, the ordinary, persistent, daily wind of the panhandle, pushed against the rock wall and arrived in the gap as a whisper. "I should not have said that," Voss said. He did not look at Rowan when he said it. He looked at the ground. "The boy is yours, and I had no right." He looked up. "Is that sufficient?" "Say it to him." Voss's eyes narrowed, but he nodded once. And when Milo came around the corner of the cabin carrying a stone for the south wall repair, Voss turned to him. "Milo, I said things about you that I should not have said. Your uncle takes care of you, and I was wrong to suggest otherwise. I'm sorry." Milo looked at Voss with the level, measuring gaze of a boy who had learned to read adults the way his uncle read stone, by testing the surface for cracks. "Thank you, Mr. Voss," Milo said. He set his stone on the wall and went back for another. Voss did not become kind. He did not become a friend. He became honest enough to survive, which on the panhandle was the minimum, and for Cal Voss, the maximum. He built a partial windscreen on the west side of his warehouse, stone hauled by his own hands, laid under Rowan's supervision with Harding and tie stones and proper batter. He failed the sample corner test once and passed it on the second attempt, which Rowan suspected was the first physical test Voss had failed at anything in 20 years. The screen stood, the warehouse held. And Voss, who had built his life on other men's desperation, learned that stone was cheaper than the reputation he had spent 6 months trying to protect. Rowan and Della married in October of 1886, 1 year after Rowan had arrived on the bench above the dry wash with a sick boy, a tired mule, and $26. The courtship had not been courtship in any way that either of them would have called by that name. It had been work, shared, daily, specific work, hauling stone, laying courses, teaching settlers, fixing roofs, feeding children, tending animals. The relationship had been built the way the wall had been built, stone by stone, with Harding packed into every void and tie stones laid at intervals to hold the thing together. The moment Rowan knew, or the moment he admitted to himself what he had known for months, came during the construction of Della's full ring. They were laying the final course on the east wall, and Della picked up a stone that Rowan had approved. She turned it, ran her thumb along the face, and set it back on the reject pile. "Fracture line," she said. "It will split in the first freeze." Rowan picked it up. He turned it. He looked at the face. He could not see the fracture. He tapped it with Niels's hand maul. The stone rang. "It is sound," he said. "It rings because the fracture is tight. Wet it." He dipped it in the water bucket. A dark line appeared along the lower face, a hairline crack, invisible when dry, obvious when water found it. Della picked up another stone from the pile, turned it once, and set it in the wall. It locked against its neighbors without rocking. "That one rings true," she said. Rowan looked at the stone in the wall. He looked at Della. He looked at the woman who could read weakness in stone and in weather and in men, and who had chosen to stand beside him not because he was strong, but because his method was sound. "Della," he said, "if you are about to say something that is not about stone, say it at supper," she said. "We have 4 more courses before dark." He said it at supper. She said yes. Milo did not say anything, but he smiled for the second time since his mother died, and the smile was wider than the first. They married at Bell's place, small ceremony, Bell standing witness. Bell wore his good coat and read from a Bible that he had carried across the staked plains in a saddlebag and that had survived 2 blizzards, a prairie fire, and a river crossing that had taken his first horse. Della moved into the cabin behind the rock ring. She brought her cows, her Winchester, her children, and a standard of stone selection that Rowan would never match and never stop trying to. Ukrainum. The settlement changed in ways that were visible to anyone who crossed the breaks in the years that followed, though the changes were not dramatic and would not have impressed a man from Dallas or San Antonio. The cabins no longer whistled. That was the simplest way to say it. On a windy day, and most days on the Panhandle were windy days, the cabins that had rock walls sat quiet. The ones that did not still sang the thin, constant song of air pushing through every seam. The difference was audible from 50 yards, and it was the difference between a settlement that was fighting the weather and a settlement that had made terms with it. By the second winter, 9 cabins had some version of Rowan's windbreak. 3 had full rock rings, Rowan's, Della's before she moved in with Rowan, and Dillard's, which his wife said was the best thing her husband had ever built and the only thing she never complained about. 4 had north wall screens. including Bell's horse shed and Lucy Strand's barn. 2 had protected entries, dogleg passages that turned the wind twice before it reached the door. The method spread not because Rowan promoted it, but because Winter promoted it. Every norther was an advertisement. Every family that survived with fuel to spare was a testimonial. Every cabin that held its heat while the unprotected ones bled was proof that required no argument. People adapted the method. Some used cedar slat screens filled with stone where river rock was scarce. Some built only north and west walls, saving labor for the sides that mattered most. Some used sod outside the rock where stone was hard to haul, creating a double barrier of different materials. The principle held across every variation. Break the wind before it reaches the cabin wall, and the cabin will hold its heat. Rowan helped anyone who asked. He refused payment. He refused credit. He refused to claim the method as property. When a man from Obedi asked if he could sell plans for the rock wall system, Rowan said no, not because he wanted to control it, but because a plan without understanding was a wall without hearting, and a wall without hearting was a death sentence in a norther. Build the corner, Rowan told every settler who asked for a shortcut. If the corner stands, build the wall. If the corner falls, learn why before you build anything. The years compress the way years do when the work is steady and the crises space out, and the children grow, and the seasons turn from threat to rhythm. Rowan and Della raised Milo, Amos, Sarah, and 2 children of their own, a boy named for Niels and a girl named for Clara. The cabin expanded, a second room added in 1888, a proper plank floor in 1889, glass windows in 1891. The rock ring expanded with it, each addition requiring new stone, new courses, new sections that Rowan and Della laid together in the autumn before each winter. Milo grew tall and thin and quiet, with his mother's narrow face and his uncle's habit of listening to things before touching them. He learned to read walls the way Niels had told Rowan to teach him, not with his eyes, but with his ears. He could press his hand against a stone course and hear whether it was settled or shifting, true or false, packed or hollow. When Rowan asked him how he knew, Milo said, "The good ones are quiet, the bad ones talk." He left the Panhandle at 19 to work on a railroad bridge crew in Oklahoma, carrying Niels's lessons into another trade. He built timber and stone cribs under trestles, and when the foreman told him to trust weight, he said what Niels had said, "Weight resists, but interlock survives." The bridges he built held. Rowan kept Niels's hand maul above the door. The iron head darkened with age, and the handle wore smooth where generations of grip had polished the grain. He did not use it. It was not a tool anymore. It was a marker, a record of the man who had taught him to build for force instead of weight, and who had died inside the wall he helped create. In old age, Rowan no longer hauled stone. His back had stiffened the way old stonemasons' backs stiffen, locked into a slight forward lean, the posture of a man who had spent decades bending toward the ground. He walked the settlement in the mornings, checking walls the way a doctor checks patients, pressing his hand against the stone, listening for the small clicks that meant a course was shifting. When the north wind rose, he stood in the gap between his stone wall and his cabin wall and listened. The sound was the sound Niels had taught him to hear, force meeting resistance, scattered and diminished, arriving at the other side as something a life could be built behind. By the second winter, 9 cabins on the Canadian River breaks sat behind stone wind walls, and on a night when the wind drove hard from the north and the temperature fell below 0 and the grass lay flat against the frozen ground, those 9 cabins did not whistle. The stoves inside them burned steady and slow, and the children inside them slept without shivering, and the men and women inside them did not feed the fire with the frantic urgency of people losing a race against the cold. The walls held the line. The air in the gaps held still. The wind that had ruled the open plains for as long as anyone could remember broke against rough stone and arrived at the cabin logs as a murmur that could not push through. Rowan Acker lived out his life on the bench above the dry wash with Della, their children, and the 2 milk cows that had outlived every prediction Cal Voss ever made about what the settlement could sustain. He never became famous. His method never carried his name beyond the breaks. It was too simple for fame: riverstone, dead air, rough faces, a crooked door, and too dependent on labor for anyone to sell it. It belonged to the people who built it, and they passed it the way Rowan had passed it to them, by building a corner and seeing if it stood. They had called it Acker's Rock Cage. The men at Pruitt's store, the riders on the Tascosa Road, the freight hands and the cattle foreman and Cal Voss himself, they had looked at a log cabin inside a ring of rough stone and seen a trapped animal, a madman's monument, a grave marker built around the living. Years later, those same men stood behind those same walls to light a match in a windstorm, and the match held. The last image belongs to Milo, grown and gone, placing Niels's hand maul against a new bridge crib in Oklahoma and pressing his ear to the stone, listening for whether the course had settled true. The stones were quiet. They had nothing to say.